Feel free to visit the link in the description below.
September 11th, 2001, a day that changed history. Unknown to most people, a third steel frame high-rise, World Trade Center 7, was also destroyed. Critical questions have been raised by more than 1,500 architects and engineers about the official explanations for the destruction of all three of these buildings. Along with more than 10,000 other concerned individuals, these professionals, collectively comprising more than 25,000 years of experience, have signed our petition. They're calling for a new investigation into the destruction of these three World Trade Center high-rises. This call is based on evidence that reveals a very different destruction scenario than reported by government engineers. This includes abundant scientific forensic data and eyewitness testimony that was omitted from the official reports. Among these experts are high-rise architects and engineers in the fields of structural design, material science, chemistry, fire protection, metallurgy, as well as physicists, explosives experts, and demolition technicians. Joining them will be firefighters and 9/11 victims' family members who support our call for a new World Trade Center investigation.
Building 7 to me is really what gives it away, because that's a classic case of controlled demolition.
It became obvious that the official story was not correct.
I watched Building 7 fall at an accelerating rate in 6.5 seconds. This was a massive 47-story structure. The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
The coup de grace for me was when I found out that Building 7 had collapsed later that day. And when I saw Building 7 come down, to me, Building 7, the fact that it looks like a perfect controlled demolition of an intact building with no visible fires. I mean, that's what I call a smoking gun.
And I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires. I can't remember even a partial collapse in any of these buildings that I've watched over the years.
It fell within 7 seconds approximately from top to bottom. This building was built in the mid-80s currently and met all the known codes at the time. Buildings just don't behave like that.
Building 7 had not been hit by a plane. To me, it was obvious that there was a controlled demolition, some explosions involved.
It was really clear from the beginning that there was this great move to, as quickly as possible, get rid of all of the rubble and move it off.
Because what they did immediately after 9/11 was they started removing the steel, the debris from Tower 7 and all the towers immediately.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
Quickly and rapidly.
It was being cut up in pieces so that no real thorough investigation could happen. That in itself is a crime, and that kind of thing needs to be investigated.
A criminal act in itself
Is a violation, in my opinion, of their professional code of ethics.
This is disconcerting, considering World Trade Center 7 would have been the first steel frame high-rise building in history to ostensibly collapse due to fire.
The government has destroyed much of the evidence.
There were all kinds of firefighters and civilians that were reporting explosions. Just the fact that there were explosions means they need to be investigated. We have overwhelming evidence that there were some explosive events. All basically the bones of the building that would have told us how this first high-rise steel structure in history that hadn't been struck by an airplane, all it had was a few fires on several floors. The way we could have learned from this was analyzing that, looking at the steel and seeing how this collapsed and how it failed and which steel members did what. Well, we can't do that because what they did immediately after 9/11 was they started removing the steel, the debris from Tower 7 and all the towers immediately.
Steel structural frame buildings, high-rise buildings, simply do not collapse due to fire. There has never been until 9/11 an experience where a high-rise building that was steel frame completely collapsed. There have been fires burned longer in similar structures without any collapse.
Definitely much more going on than just fire.
Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, they had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. How could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
What happened to those columns to all collapse at the same time? The explanation provided does not match the evidence that we have. We've never had a steel-framed skyscraper collapse in the United States or internationally, so there's no precedent. I don't think Building 7 could have collapsed by fire. There's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed.
NIST reports admits fell at the rate of gravity for the first 100 feet. Well, that's impossible unless there's nothing resisting it. It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet. Which, the only way you can get that is when there's zero resistance. And so what we're looking at is a building just coming straight down, falling right through itself with zero resistance. Buildings don't have zero resistance, which is why you feel comfortable walking into a building.
A building cannot do free fall with a huge steel structural system in place to support it without it being blown up. That's the only way it could come down at free fall.
In order for it to be falling down with zero resistance, it means that resistance had to have been removed by something else.
And this claims that the columns were buckling in the first several seconds before the free fall occurred. Now, I don't see how that's possible.
In the final report, they modified it, they tried to doctor it up. They still tried to say that it was essentially correct, but then they modified it, and they actually admitted there was a period of free fall involved. But they never changed their model. Like, how do you all of a sudden allow for free fall when they just got done explaining how it couldn't have been in free fall? If I were a scientist in this, I'd be embarrassed to try to put forward something like that. It was clearly a fraudulent argument. In other words, NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So that evidence alone would indicate that the official story doesn't hold water.
A building cannot do free fall with a huge steel structural system in place to support it.
There's no resistance until the building is down maybe halfway.
Buildings tend to be delayed as they collapse. They don't just pancake down like this in a very short period of time.
If the pancake theory works, it's going to hit hesitation, and there was no hesitation.
Going from motionless to free fall instantly.
One continuous motion. There couldn't have been any structural resistance.
Buildings just don't behave like that. If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it, and there's some delay there.
The fact that it's coming down at free fall says all of the energy is being used to just make it go straight down, which means it's coming down through itself and not breaking up the building as it goes. Something else has to be clearing the way. And that is smoking gun evidence to me. I think that's one of the primary pieces of evidence that these buildings really were demolished. They weren't just accidents that happen.
It's not logical or reasonable.
If, there was some fire in one corner, it would have collapsed maybe in that corner, but not the total building free falling.
Yeah, that corner's going top lower, but we didn't see that. We saw it come straight down.
If the buildings had come down by fire, we would have seen a more natural progression of collapse. We may have seen, the buildings actually topple over to one side, certainly not coming down in its own footprint.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
It would not have been a uniform collapse. The building might have partially fallen over, but the building would not have collapsed as it did. This doesn't make any logical sense.
For it to come down straight down upon itself, you would need to basically take out the supports at the center, at the core.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside, at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
I would expect the center of the building to start moving first, and then as the implosion progresses, then the sides come in, then the rest of the building is involved. What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
And there were so many columns in the building that were not affected by either the fires or the impact damage, and they all came down just at once. So it's a little disheartening, and it's implausible.
Logic tells you that if you have a single failure at some random point in the building, that the entire building is not going to collapse. The collapse would have been a chaotic, random event. The building would have partially collapsed, possibly, but it didn't. There was a total collapse, and there's very few things that could explain that, none of which are addressed by the NIST report. According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means, basically, as they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense.
And I strongly believe that it had to have been controlled demolition, controlled charges, explosives, something of that type, because it was a sudden failure.
Controlled demolition. There's no way that fire did what they said it did to that building. Impossible. Couldn't happen. It just did not make sense that a building that had a few minor fires in it could possibly succumb the way it did. If there was damage, it would have been minor. There might have been some deflection of a beam or two here or there, but not a total and unequivocal, complete collapse. It just doesn't ring true.
A few fires in that building, and they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
To me, it was obvious that there was some controlled demolition and some explosions involved.
When I saw Building 7 fall, it to me appeared to be controlled demolition because it fell in free fall manner into itself. It is my opinion, as a former 12 Bravo combat engineer, well-trained in the use of explosives, that all three buildings were brought down as a result of controlled demolition.
These buildings were designed to take multiple impacts from airliners.
It's built to withstand a 707.
They stated that the fuel would be dumped into the building, but the building would still be there. Although most of the fuel blew out the opposite side of the building.
The majority of the jet fuel was burnt up instantly in the big fireball, and it was gone. The fires that were left were office furnishings and carpet and things like that. A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
To use our own powers of observation, you could tell by seeing these fires and seeing black smoke come out the windows, that means that the fires were oxygen starved and it was incomplete combustion. And so it was a low temperature fire.
That jet fuel had to have been burning at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit. I also noticed that the official explanation of what happened there was that the heat from the fire supposedly softened the steel and thereby brought the buildings down. If you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it. So immediately I knew at that point that the official explanation was dead wrong. There was no way those flames could have possibly brought about the collapse of the building.
It did not seem possible that these towers that were designed to withstand the impact of a 707 could possibly collapse in such a short order of time from the time that they were hit. There's no way the building was designed to take the impact of one, if not more, multiple airplanes. They were designed to withstand hurricane force winds of up to 140 miles an hour.
My first reaction was that looks like controlled demolition.
I would not have expected the whole building to just give in at once, and I thought it rather odd that they fell almost perfectly in very similar ways. It seemed odd that lightning would strike twice.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it. The top section is not crushing the bottom section of the building, or it would meet resistance. This structure was capable of holding 3 to 5 times the weight, and here it is falling through it with a resistance of only 1/3 of its weight. Roughly 90% of the resistance has been removed, and what's happening is the top section is not crushing down the lower section like a pile driver, which is the picture that NIST basically is painting.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore. I think that should really frighten all of us.
Given the way the planes hit the building, one side would have given away first, and it just would have fallen off or fallen over at a steep angle, but the way the whole thing just gave way at once and started to plummet down without slowing down as it went down. Again, just like the controlled demolition I witnessed personally.
The area below the damage zone, where the planes flew in and where the fire was, that area below that, those 80 or 90 stories, 80,000 tons of structural steel, was not damaged in any way. Yet you stood there and watched it destroy itself, wiping out floor by floor all 287 structural columns as if they didn't exist underneath the damage zone.
There's so many videos of witnesses from that day that report explosions. There's radio transmissions from the FDNY. We have the transcripts that were recorded, back in 2001 of all these firefighters and first responders reporting explosions. There's no doubt they were hurt.
That whole thing looks nothing like a building falling down. It's a building being blown up. And it's being blown up progressively from the top down. That's what the physics shows.
The speed at which it fell exhibited all the signs of demolitions and the completeness of the destruction down to their individual elements.
The fact that it was all reduced to rubble and powder just did not make sense at all.
We have no explanation of how the concrete was pulverized. It takes an enormous amount of energy, way beyond what we have in aviation fuel.
I knew there had to be more to the story than just a fire causing those failures. There had to be a controlled demolition that we were witnessing. The government has lied to us, and we need to get to the truth. Those victims deserve the truth. They deserve justice.
The explanations from FEMA and from NIST don't add up. but there is enormous circumstantial evidence, circumstantial and actually physical evidence as well, that would lead us to a different conclusion. And the conclusion is controlled demolition.
Any honest investigator would be looking at this and looking for explosives and so forth. And this investigation didn't go there. They just would not look for explosives. There have been explosives found in the dust.
And the physical chemistry of everything that I wrote about is consistent with no other hypothesis. And all the testimony of eyewitnesses, all the video evidence supports only controlled demolition as a cause of all 3 World Trade Center buildings' destruction.
The only thing that you can say about their participation in this is that it must have been an orchestrated cover-up.
We know we've been lied to about 9/11. We don't know for sure who did it. We don't know exactly how they did everything. But in the meantime, there are things we do know. We do know that there was a massive cover-up, that there was evidence hidden and destroyed.
The only way we're going to come back together is to reopen the wound, talk about this. It can be very difficult to come to terms with what actually happened. Someone told me recently, I wouldn't believe what you're telling me even if it were true. These experts in psychology highlight their valuable experience for us as to why this evidence can still be so difficult for people to accept.
9/11 truth challenges some of our most fundamental beliefs about our government and about our country. When your beliefs are challenged or when 2 beliefs are inconsistent, cognitive dissonance is created.
At this point, we have 9 years of hard scientific evidence that disproves the government theory about what happened on September 11th, and yet people continue to be either oblivious to the fact that this information exists or completely resistant to looking at this information. We know this had a very severe and traumatic impact on a majority of the population.
As humans, each of us have a worldview, and that worldview is usually formed in great part by the culture we grow up in. When we hear information that contradicts our worldview, social psychologists call the resulting insecurity cognitive dissonance. For example, with 9/11, we have one cognition, which is the official story of 9/11, what our government told us, what our media repeated to us over and over, that 19 Muslims attacked us. On the other hand, we have what scientists, researchers, architects, engineers are now beginning to tell us, which is that there is evidence that shows that the official story cannot be true. So now we've lost our sense of security. We are starting to feel vulnerable. Now we're confused.
When your beliefs are challenged, fear and anxiety are created. In response to that, our psychological defenses kick in, and they protect us from these emotions. Denial, which is probably the most primitive psychological defense, is the one most likely to kick in.
And eventually, our mind shuts off. Just like when a computer is overloaded, our minds get overloaded. We can't handle it anymore, and we shut down. It's easier to deny it and move on with our lives.
Many people respond to these truths in a very deep way. Some have a visceral reaction like they've been punched in the stomach. To begin to accept the possibility that the government was involved is like opening Pandora's box. If you open the lid and peek in a little bit, it's going to challenge some of your fundamental beliefs about the world.
As I thought about all of these responses, I realized that what is common to every one of them is the emotion of fear. People are afraid of being ostracized, they're afraid of being alienated, they're afraid of being shunned, they're afraid of their lives being inconvenienced, they'd have to change their lives, they're afraid of being confused, they're afraid of psychological deterioration, they're afraid of feeling helpless and vulnerable, and they're afraid that they won't be able to handle feelings that are coming up. None of us want to feel helpless and vulnerable. So we want to defend ourselves, and the way we often do that is with anger. So then we become angry, and when we become angry, then we become indignant, we become offended, we want to ridicule the messenger, we want to pathologize the messenger, and we want to censor the messenger.
So how can we overcome this resistance to denial? The first thing is to meet people where they're at.
One thing is that we need to raise people's awareness about this through what I would call gentle dialogue and gentle questioning. A good way is to ask questions, ask open-ended questions, and lead them into a dialogue and discussion about it.
Healing comes through facing the truth, experiencing it, allowing the feelings to come in. So if there are feelings of fear that perhaps these events were caused by something we haven't thought about yet, dark elements within our society, for example, we'll let that come in and explore it. Let the light shine on whatever happened. This will be the most healing process. So I think as a psychologist, to overcome our fear of the traumatic event with new information would be the best, healthiest route to our collective recovery from the trauma of 9/11. To gradually uncover the truth in your own life, the source of anxiety, to make them conscious, is the royal road to recovery.
One of the ways to deal with the trauma is to find the answer.
To expose what happened regardless of where the evidence takes us.
We need the truth in order to heal.
So my brother was my best friend. David has always been a firefighter. My brother wanted to save people's lives. I'm a family member trying to find out the answers to the murder of 3,000 plus people.
My husband Steve was 48 years old when he was killed on September 11th. It seems to me we should know why over 1,000 victims there are no trace for, and no identification, no trace of over 1,000 victims.
Just a few years ago, they were still finding body parts on the roofs of buildings. What is that?
We should know why there are over 700 bone fragments found on the top of Deutsche Bank building less than a half an inch long. We should have that information. Why were they up there? Why weren't they found? What kind of explosion was there?
And the explosions were brought up many a times, talking to firemen, talking to medics, talking to everyone. Everybody talked about these explosions.
I want the officials that are in power to ask the questions. I want answers. We never had answers.
Please look at architects and engineers. People all around the world, scientists all around the world are questioning this, that these towers could not have come down.